brother Tom, and to hold this newest one gently and quietly, because she was just an infant, and her name was Maggie. I was given a bottle and told to feed this baby, while the other kids went streaking out the front door to the old lot across the street, where all the neighborhood children were at play. Screams of pleasure and abandon pierced the living room where I sat in an armchair holding my baby sister, who seemed to me quite leaden, swathed as she was, in thick cotton blankets. My resentment blossomed into rage when it dawned on me that I was not to be allowed my freedom that afternoon, that I was, in fact, being held prisoner by this lump of obligation called a sister, and that not only had my siblings abandoned me, but my mother had as well. With growing fury, I rose and carried the baby into the kitchen, where I placed her on the countertop. I then took the bottle, unscrewed the lid, and poured the milk into the sink. At 4 years of age, I was sturdy and capable, or so my mother clearly thought, besetting me with duties far beyond my ken. My mother would pay for this injustice, and she would come to appreciate that I not only needed but deserved to play with the other kids at dusk in the old lot. With hatred and precision, I turned the faucet on, and when the water ran cold, I filled the bottle up. I gathered Maggie and the bottle in my arms and trudged back to the armchair where, without hesitation, I fed my little sister the bottle of ice-cold water that would kill her. When my mother at last came home and retrieved her baby, I struggled to tell her that it was I who had dealt the death blow, which was why Maggie now lay in her crib silent and inert. I desperately wanted to confess to this homicide and clear my conscience, but my mother would have none of it, and shooed me out the door to join my friends in what was left of the day's play. The next morning, I crept into the nursery and on tiptoe peered closely at my sister. Maggie gazed at me with mild eyes and gurgled as only very sentient babies do. At that moment, I heard peals of laughter emanating from the basement and raced out of the room and down the stairs. The sound of my mother's laughter was the sound I lived for, because it was absolute and good. I found her doubled over, clutching her sides, tears streaming down her cheeks as she pointed helplessly at the walls. Months before, my mother had painted the walls of the basement with murals depicting popular fairy tales and nursery rhymes. The Three Little Pigs, Little Red Riding Hood, Mary Had a Little Lamb, Jack and the Beanstalk, and, of course, Sleeping Beauty. The murals were very clever because my mother had been an artist before she had married my father and become an indentured servant, however glorified. "Look, kitten, look!" she cried, pulling me by the hand until I was just inches from the Three Little Pigs. Only then did I realize that a P-51 Mustang bomber had been painted to indicate the imminent annihilation of not only the Three Little Pigs, but when I looked to the opposite wall, I saw that Little Red Riding Hood had a missile suspended directly over her head, and that Jack was clinging with particular fervor to the beanstalk as bomber after bomber dove from beneath my mother's fluffy clouds, threatening to destroy the idyllic landscape. Some wicked-looking soldiers had been painted peering out from behind a barn, one of whom, wearing a helmet, held a rifle to the little lamb's head, and yet another leered at Little Red Riding Hood, all of which seemed to delight my mother and kept her, as she herself would say, in veritable stitches. When my father came home after his daily nip at the Lux Club, my mother gave him the cold shoulder and said, "Boy, are you in trouble." He grinned sheepishly, which I thought an inappropriate response to my mother's obvious displeasure. We were put to bed early that night, but when I was sure my brothers and sisters were fast asleep, I stole out of my little bed and worked my way stealthily down the stairs. I discovered my parents in the basement, their shapes only partly visible in the dimly lit room, but it was clear that they were holding on to each other, and that their faces were very close together, and that my father was grinning, and my mother was laughing, until suddenly, and for no reason at all, they pressed their faces together and stayed like that for a long, long time. Desire and disillusion created the chiaroscuro of my parents' early marriage. Just a year earlier, my mother had danced with Jack Kennedy at the inaugural ball, and